You start a software company at 26 with two friends from college. And by the time it's worth talking about, a real company, real revenue, real employees who depend on it, you've raised 5 rounds of funding, brought on senior executives with meaningful equity packages, and watched your own ownership stake get diluted from a comfortable 60% down to something closer to 6%. On paper, that sounds like a story about losing your company slowly, one funding round at a time, the founder's classic tragedy. Except you're still the CEO, you still set the strategy, still make the final call on every major decision, still can't be removed from your own board seat without your explicit consent. Somewhere between 60% and 6%, something in the actual mechanics of ownership shifted, and almost nobody explains clearly what that something actually is, mostly because the explanation requires separating two things everyone assumes are the same, and they aren't. Owning a company and controlling a company are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where a huge amount of real corporate power actually lives. Most people assume ownership percentage and control are locked together, that owning 51% means you run things, and owning 6% means you're along for the ride. That assumption is roughly true for a small business with one class of ordinary shares, the kind most people picture when they think about a company. It stops being true almost entirely once you introduce a mechanism that's been standard in the corporate world for decades and has become especially common among founder-led tech companies over the last 20 years: the dual-class share structure. Here's the mechanism, stripped down to its simplest form. A company can issue more than one class of stock, and those classes don't have to carry the same rights. The most common version splits shares into 2 classes. Class A shares, typically what gets sold to public investors, employees, and most outside shareholders, usually carry 1 vote per share, the version everyone assumes is standard. Class B shares, typically held by the founders and sometimes early insiders, often carry 10 votes per share, and in some structures even more than that. The economic value of a Class A share and a Class B share is frequently identical. Both represent the same claim on the company's profits, the same dividend rights if dividends get paid, the same value if the company gets sold. What differs isn't what the share is worth. What differs is how much say that share gets in choosing who runs the place. This is the distinction the entire video rests on, so it's worth stating plainly before going any further. Economic ownership is your claim on the value of the company, what you'd receive if it paid a dividend, what you'd receive if it got acquired, what your shares are actually worth on a balance sheet. Voting control is your say in who sits on the board, who gets hired or fired as CEO, and what major structural decisions get approved. In a simple one-class company, these two things move together automatically. In a dual-class company, they can be almost completely separated from each other, on purpose, by design, written into the company's founding documents years before anyone outside the company ever hears about it. Back to your software company. When you and your 2 co-founders started it, you all held ordinary shares, 1 class, 1 vote each, ownership and control perfectly aligned because there was nothing yet to separate. The first meaningful shift happens during your Series A round. 18 months in, when your lead investor's law firm suggests, not unusually, this is close to standard practice for venture-backed companies expecting to raise multiple future rounds, that the company restructure into 2 share classes before the round closes. The investors buying in will receive Class A shares, 1 vote each, standard investor terms. You and your co-founders convert your existing ordinary shares into Class B shares, carrying 10 votes each. At the moment of that conversion, your economic percentage of the company doesn't change at all. What changes is that going forward, every future round of investors, every employee stock option that eventually gets exercised, every share sold to the public if the company ever goes public, dilutes your economic percentage steadily, round after round, while your voting percentage erodes far more slowly, because each of your shares is doing the voting work of 10 ordinary shares. Run the actual math across the life of the company, because the gap between 6% economic ownership and functional control isn't abstract, it's arithmetic. At founding, you and your co-founders collectively hold 100% of both economic value and voting power, no distinction yet because there's only 1 class. After the Series A, new investors take 20% of the economic pie, leaving founders at 80% economically. But because the investor shares carry standard voting rights, and the founder shares now carry 10 times the voting weight per share, founders retain something close to 96% of total voting power, despite owning only 80% of total value. by the time the company has gone through a Series B, a Series C, a Series D, and a Series E, granted meaningful equity to a VP of engineering, a chief revenue officer, and roughly 200 employees through an option pool, founder economic ownership has been diluted down to a combined 18%, split three ways, putting your individual stake somewhere around 6%. But because the voting structure was designed at the very first restructuring to preserve founder control specifically against this kind of dilution, the three founders together still control approximately 54% of total voting power. Not because any single mechanism blocked dilution, but because the 10-to-1 voting ratio was calibrated from the start to survive exactly this many rounds of economic dilution before control itself became genuinely at risk. Founders often have unique, difficult-to-transfer knowledge of the company's product, culture, and long-term vision, and short-term shareholder pressure, quarterly earnings expectations, activist investors pushing for immediate buybacks or dividends instead of long-term reinvestment can genuinely damage a company's ability to make decisions that only pay off 5 or 10 years out. A founder insulated from being removed after one bad quarter can make a bet on a multi-year product direction that a founder facing an activist shareholder campaign might not survive long enough to see through. This isn't a hypothetical talking point. It's the explicit rationale companies cite in their own governance documents when explaining why they've chosen a dual-class structure. And it's the reason venture capital firms, despite being the ones diluted fastest by it, frequently support the arrangement rather than fighting it. The argument against is just as real and deserves equal weight rather than a token mention. A founder who can't be removed can also make genuinely bad, self-serving, or even reckless decisions with very little accountability. Because the normal corporate mechanism for checking a CEO, the threat that shareholders can eventually vote them out, has been deliberately disabled. There are well-documented cases of dual-class structures allowing founders to pursue vanity projects, resist reasonable acquisition offers that would have benefited ordinary shareholders, or maintain control for years after their judgment had clearly deteriorated. Specifically because the voting math made removal functionally impossible, regardless of performance. Several major stock indices have, at various points, restricted or excluded companies with certain dual-class structures, specifically because of these accountability concerns. This isn't a settled, one-sided story where founder control is simply good, and any video that presents it that way is leaving out half the picture on purpose. Back to your company and how this actually plays out in a boardroom rather than in the abstract. By year 7, with your combined founder voting stake still sitting around 54%, a major activist investor who's accumulated a meaningful Class A position starts publicly pushing for the board to explore a sale, arguing the company is undervalued and shareholders would benefit from an acquisition at a premium. Under a single class structure, with enough Class A shares accumulated and enough other shareholders persuaded to vote alongside them, this kind of pressure can genuinely force a board's hand. Under your dual-class structure, the activist's economic stake, even a meaningful one, translates into a much smaller fraction of actual voting power, because every Class A share they've accumulated is doing 1/10 the voting work of a founder's Class B share. The board still has to take the pressure seriously. Public criticism from a large shareholder is a real reputational and business problem regardless of the voting math. But the activist cannot force a vote outcome against the founder's wishes the way they likely could in a single-class structure. Whether that protects the company's long-term interests or insulates underperforming leadership from legitimate accountability depends entirely on whether, in this specific case, the founder's judgment turns out to be right. There's no version of this mechanism that guarantees a good outcome. It only guarantees that the outcome gets decided by the people the structure was designed to protect. This is also where dual-class structures eventually run into their own natural limits, and it's worth being precise about what those limits actually are, rather than implying founder control as permanent and absolute. Most dual-class structures include what's called a sunset provision, a clause specifying that the enhanced voting rights automatically convert down to standard one vote per share status after a triggering event, commonly a fixed number of years after going public, or when a founder's economic ownership falls below a specified minimum threshold, often somewhere between 5% and 10%, or upon a founder's death or departure from an active role at the company. These provisions exist specifically because investors, over the last decade, have pushed back hard against structures with no expiration date at all, arguing that founder control makes sense while a founder is actively building the company, but becomes harder to justify decades later, particularly if control ends up passing to heirs who had no role in building anything. Your own company's structure includes exactly this kind of provision. The enhanced voting rights convert automatically if any founder's economic stake drops below 4%, which is part of why you and your co-founders have been careful across multiple funding rounds about exactly how much additional dilution you personally accept in later rounds versus what gets absorbed by the broader option pool instead. It's also worth walking through what this looks like from the other side of the table, because the mechanism only makes sense once you understand why sophisticated investors agree to it in the first place, rather than simply refusing to invest in companies structured this way. Picture a venture capital partner evaluating your company at the Series C round. 5 years in, she's reviewing a term sheet where her fund would acquire Class A shares, 1 vote each, in a company where the founders collectively hold Class B shares carrying 10 votes each. On its face, this looks like a worse deal than a comparable company offering equal voting rights per dollar invested. But she's not evaluating the voting rights in isolation. She's evaluating the entire package, including the founder's track record, the company's growth trajectory, and critically, the specific terms of the sunset provision governing when those enhanced voting rights expire. If the provision is well drafted, converting automatically once founder ownership drops below a reasonable floor, or after a fixed number of years, she can model out exactly how much control risk she's actually taking on and price the investment accordingly. Founders with poorly negotiated or absent sunset provisions often face a real cost for it, either in the form of a lower valuation, since investors discount for indefinite lack of accountability, or an outright refusal from more governance-conscious funds who simply won't invest in structures without a clear expiration date on founder control. This pricing dynamic is worth naming explicitly, because it's the market's actual answer to the question of whether dual-class structures are good or bad. Not a clean yes or no, but a continuous negotiation where investors extract a discount, a stronger sunset provision, or additional board protections in exchange for accepting reduced voting power. A founder who wants 10-to-1 voting shares with no sunset clause and no other concessions will generally get a lower valuation and a smaller pool of interested investors than a founder proposing the same structure with a clear, investor-friendly expiration trigger attached. Founders pay for enhanced control in one currency or another, whether that's a discounted valuation, a firmer board oversight structure in other areas, or simply a narrower set of investors willing to accept the terms at all. There's also a specific moment where this entire structure gets tested in a way that has nothing to do with hypothetical activist pressure, and it's worth walking through because it clarifies exactly what the mechanism does and doesn't protect against. Suppose one of your two co-founders, several years in, decides to leave the company entirely to start something unrelated. Under most well-drafted dual-class agreements, a departed founder's enhanced voting shares don't simply travel with them out the door at full strength. Many structures include a specific conversion trigger tied to active involvement. Enhanced voting rights that convert down to standard shares automatically once a founder is no longer serving in an active operating or board role, precisely to prevent a departed founder from retaining outsized control over a company they're no longer meaningfully contributing to. This detail rarely makes headlines, but it's one of the more important safeguards built into modern dual-class structures, because without it, a founder who left acrimoniously years earlier could theoretically still block decisions made by the team actually running the company day to day. Your own founding agreement includes this exact provision, which is part of why, when your third co-founder eventually does step back from day-to-day involvement in year 6 to focus on a different venture, her voting shares convert down automatically, and the practical control of the company consolidates further between you and your remaining co-founder, rather than staying split 3 ways indefinitely. None of this requires you to be a majority owner to remain functionally in charge, and that's the entire point worth taking away from the mechanics, rather than the specific numbers. Control in a properly structured company isn't a direct function of economic ownership percentage. It's a function of voting rights, which are a separate, deliberately engineered layer sitting on top of ownership, negotiated at specific moments, usually early, usually before a company has much leverage to negotiate anything, and preserved or eroded based on decisions made at every subsequent round of dilution afterward. A CEO holding 6% of their own company isn't necessarily a founder who's lost control through a long, sad story of dilution. They may be a founder who negotiated the voting structure correctly from the very beginning and has been protecting it deliberately, round after round, ever since. There's a version of this story that goes differently, and it's worth naming directly rather than pretending every founder navigates this well. Plenty of founders, particularly first-time founders raising their first institutional round without experienced legal counsel, accept standard single-class terms because nobody at the table specifically raises the dual-class option, or because raising it feels like an aggressive, trust-eroding move to make with a new investor relationship. Those founders dilute economically and lose voting control at exactly the same rate, round after round. And by the time the company is large enough that control genuinely matters, they've often already lost the leverage to renegotiate it. The dual-class conversation, when it happens at all, almost always happens at the earliest possible round, specifically because that's the only moment where a founder has enough leverage relative to investors to actually secure it. Waiting until after a company is successful to ask for enhanced voting rights rarely works, because by then the negotiating leverage has shifted decisively toward whoever's writing the check. This is, in the end, the actual mechanism behind a headline that shows up periodically in tech and business coverage: a founder controlling a company despite owning a single-digit percentage of it, and it's worth understanding as engineering rather than magic or luck. A share is not one thing, it's a bundle of specific negotiable rights, and economic value and voting power are simply two of those rights that happen to travel together by default, and can be deliberately separated by design. Companies separate them for a real debatable reason: a bet that founder continuity produces better long-term decisions than continuous shareholder-driven governance, and reasonable, well-informed people land on different sides of whether that bet is generally worth making. What isn't debatable is the mechanism itself. Ownership percentage tells you what someone's shares are worth. It does not, by itself, tell you who's actually running the company, and the difference between those two numbers is written into corporate charters, negotiated at specific funding rounds, and preserved or lost based on choices made years before most outside observers ever think to ask the question at all. The next time a headline mentions a founder holding a single-digit stake in a company worth billions, the honest question isn't how they let their ownership slip so low. It's whether years earlier, at a round nobody was paying attention to yet, somebody at the table thought to ask for 10 votes instead of 1.